Locke is most famous for making the argument individualistically about toleration, and typically in places where religious toleration, separation of church and state has become institutionalized, it's almost always Lockean arguments that are the most basic arguments. So what I've given you here is a thumbnail theoretical sketch, right, or my understanding of how, over the last couple of centuries, the major thinkers in the liberal tradition, right, who are friendly to liberty in all of its manifestations, liberty in economics, liberty in politics, liberty in religion, liberty in personal lifestyle, and so forth, have contributed elements of our overall understanding of why it is, right, that in cultures that have institutionalized liberal principles, people are better off. Right? And so there's both theoretical arguments here and the practical data that now in the last generation or so is becoming better tuned and more easily available to make the case here. All right, so here's the list of points. Capitalism increases freedom, increases productive effort, increases innovation, coordination, right, et cetera, and the list goes on. Now, first follow-up question then is, that's a lot of claims, right? Made by a lot of people, right? Are they all true? Right? And I've given you 20-second versions, right, of all of those arguments. All of those arguments need to be made in much greater detail with good supporting data and so on. And within the circle of people who are friendly to liberal institutions, there's ongoing debate about how to fine-tune the arguments, which ones are more important, right, and so forth. But what I want to turn next to is the issue that despite what strikes me as a very powerful empirical case for the benefits of liberal society, and a very powerful theoretical case for the power of liberal society, among intellectuals, the liberal position is still the minority tradition. I work in universities in the United States, I got my education in Canada, I traveled around, and I am in this small minority, right, in the academic world of people, right, who think this. And so there's a very interesting question about why that is the case, right? And for me, it can be a puzzling issue. Of course, it could be that I just got biases, right, and so forth, and there are glaring flaws in all of these arguments, and if I were more open-minded, I could see those. I'm willing to entertain those arguments as well. But what I want to do now is try to understand why the arguments have not been as convincing to people who are on the other sides of the fence, various alternative understandings about how society, right, should go. And so this is the next part of the talk here. And there's two categories of people here. There's many politicians, right, who are opposed to liberal markets, right, in many respects. They want centralization, they want to be able to dispense power, they want to manage the economy, right, in various ways as opposed to letting the market work things out, and many intellectuals who are behind them. I'm going to jump ahead here. I want to make a point that history has a lot to do with it. And one of the things that occurs in culture more generally is that cultural change is very slow. And intellectual culture change can be even slower. And so despite the fact that great things have occurred in the last 2 centuries, 2 centuries is a blink of an eye in historical time. Right? And I think this is an important point to emphasize, and so that's what I want to do. Before we got to modern society, that is to say prior to 1750, 1800 or so, for tens of thousands of years, it's unimaginable numbers of generations. Take 200 years, right, and multiply it by 10. And multiply that by 10 again. And multiply that by 10 again. Now you are talking about human beings in the earliest stages. They're living tribally. And for tens of thousands of years, hundreds and hundreds of generations, they are living essentially the same way, tribally, in all cultures all over the world. Feudalism that has come along in the last few centuries, the last few millennia, the Egyptians, the ancient Indian civilization, ancient Chinese civilization, and so on, even in historical times, those are relative newcomers. Right? And what is built into tribalism and feudalism. And here I come back to the theme of heroes. Who are the top people in those cultures? Whom does one look up to? If you're a little boy, who are your role models? If you're a little girl, who are your role models? And for thousands of years, who are the role models in these cultures? And there are two. This is one. This is a European knight. This is a Japanese knight, a samurai. But they are structurally exactly the same. The people who are at the top of the heap in the society are the warriors, the people who fight, who are good at the martial arts, who become wealthy because they are able very successfully to kill people and take their stuff. And that is what your whole life is dedicated to. And if you are a little boy, your aspiration is to become very good at killing people, taking their stuff, and making other people do what you want to do. And then for thousands of years, that becomes culturally inbred as a role model. And this is essentially the predatory lifestyle. Human beings live as predators. Some people are better at predation than others. They become top in society. The other people have to do what they tell them to do. They get the best women, they get the best land, they get the best everything right in society, and it is a win-lose, or it is a zero-sum predatory. Now, what this then means is that for tens of thousands of years, right, built into cultural psychology, right, is the idea that the people who are rich and powerful are predators, that that's the rules of the game. And into modern times, that inheritance comes across many generations. Obviously, there still are many people in our culture, right, who get to the top through predatory fashion, right, and so forth. Sometimes they're more sneaky about it, using political means, right, as opposed to naked aggression and so forth. But the point is that transforming away from thinking of the top people as the top predators to thinking of people who create wealth, that is very new in cultural time. The attitude that traditional warriors and aristocrats have toward people who go into business, toward people who work with their hands, towards people who trade material goods and so forth, was scorn. Those people are beneath my dignity. Dealing with money, dealing with material production, right, and so on, that is something the lower orders do. The idea that there can be anything dignified or noble about wealth, business, and pursuit, that is brand new in human history. Only a few centuries, and we are still learning. Now, the other set of role models, here I have a Western example and an Eastern example. Again, who are the heroes, the ones we look up to, are going to be not merely priests, but people who take a religious calling to the extreme and try to dedicate themselves to that religious calling. And traditionally, what the religious calling meant, right, in its most pure form, is a detachment from the material world, a detachment from things physical, a devotion to an alternative reality. And to the extent that you have to make a living, you do not make a living. That's not even the right word to use, because you don't make, right, so to speak. You don't get a living through working primarily. You are supported by charity, right, from the broad mass of people, and to the extent that you have more wealth as a priest or a monk or a nun, you engage in acts of charity to people who are worse off than you are. Now, there can be a place for charity right in a society, but there's a difference between saying charity is something we do for the few unfortunate people who can't support themselves to get them back on their feet, to saying that charity is the most noble thing that you can do, and that working for a living, earning your hands, trying to make a profit, trading with people and so forth, again, is something that we disparage, right, that we look down upon. And all of the major Western traditions, prior to some softening of some of those traditions in the modern world, have consistently disparaged people who go into business, who earn wealth, who deal with money, and so forth. And again, those attitudes change very slowly over the course of many centuries. Now, the point that I want to make is if we get to contemporary times, right, what we have is a significant number of people who are well-versed in the historical, intellectual traditions who take, right, from that intellectual tradition that the choice is between predators, right, and people who engage in charity. And that dualistic way of thinking about social organization is deeply ingrained in many contemporary intellectual traditions. And from their perspective, the idea of an entrepreneur who creates value is invisible to them. They literally do not understand that. And so from their perspective, when you were talking about business and when you're talking about politics, politics can only mean one of two things, and business can only mean one of two things. It can mean that you are very clever at plundering, at predatorily taking from other people, right? And of course lots of politicians and people in business right, do that, or your other function as a politician or a businessman is to engage in philanthropy, to give goodies out to various target people, right, and so forth. And that is your entire understanding of how the political process and how the market process works. That is, from the liberal perspective, the intellectual mindset that has been institutionalized in some academic circles and in many political circles. That is what has to be fought. Right? All right, now, I don't want to end on the negative. How do we change things around? Sometimes I get depressed about things in the United States, and please don't take this the wrong way, but I can cheer myself up by reading the news from Argentina. Right, and I'm sure you guys can cheer yourselves up by reading the news from Bolivia, right, where things are even worse. So we do face, right, big problems. We do have entrenched predators, right? We do have entrenched people who want to redistribute our wealth, right, against our wills. Right? They don't trust us to engage in voluntary charity and to build positive solutions, right, and so on. What I'm going to do is take this theme of entrepreneurship and show how I think it can be the positive strategy for turning things around. We can make lots of abstract arguments, right, about political economy and so forth, and those are important to make, but that's going to reach a very small percentage of the population. We can crunch all kinds of data and show charts, right, and so forth. Again, that's going to reach a small percentage, right, of the population. That is important to make it because that small percentage of the population of people who are intellectuals have a great deal of cultural power, long-term power, but we need bridge concepts that translate the abstract, right, into the practical. And I think entrepreneurship, particularly entrepreneurship at this moment in history, is a very powerful vehicle for communicating deeply liberal ideas. Right? So what I want to do is ask this chart here, for example. Undergraduate students can understand this chart. Right? The average education person can understand this chart. And if we ask, why did that happen? Isn't that an awesome thing, right? That we live in a world in which people are so much wealthier. And people, yeah, that's good, right? It's better to be alive and living for a long time, right, than dying poor after a short period of time. Okay, that is not intellectual rocket science. But who made that happen? Did monks meditating in caves lift us out of the cave? No, they did not. Was it samurai knights who transformed Japan into an economic powerhouse? No, it was not. Right? Who did it? And I'll still speak as an American here. The people who made us as fabulously rich as we are entrepreneurs, right? And we know who they are. So in the American context, Cyrus McCormick, he built his business up in Chicago, right, where I am from, in agricultural machinery. Right? One of the things why people don't starve to death in the developed countries, why I live in the Midwest, for example. We had a horrible drought last summer, but nobody was worried about starving to death this past winter, right? Because of people like Cyrus McCormick, who mechanized agriculture. He developed the first combine machine that both cut and separated the good parts of the grain from the chaff, and enabled the productivity of agriculture to increase by a factor of 150, right? Increasing vast more amounts of food, and as mechanization of agriculture spread over the world, right, and so on. It's one of the great success stories, 19th century American. He did it with no government protection. He did not get subsidies. He did not get regulations passed against his competitors. He was a pure market entrepreneur, a technical genius, good at marketing, finance, and so on. And he has indirectly fed billions of people over the last century and a half. Henry Ford, right, he is a synonym for the mechanization, right, of cars. Took cars, which used to be a luxury object for rich people, and put a car in almost every American's garage, right, and then around the world. But he was an entrepreneur when he was a young man tinkering in his backyard garage. His neighbors thought that he was nuts. Right? His nickname was Crazy Henry, right? But he nonetheless persevered. He had a vision. He made it happen. Right? We know that story. And so the ability of people to travel and see the world, to live not necessarily 2 minutes walk from their work, but to live out. I know commuting is a double-edged sword here, right? But the unbelievable transportation potential that we all enjoy now because of individuals like Henry Ford. James Hill, also Canadian-born like me, and actually I take some false pride here because he and I went to the same high school in Canada. He emigrated to the United States a long time before I did, but his claim to fame is that he built a transcontinental railroad, right, from across in the 19th century, across the United States, taking the northern route. He did it with no government subsidies, he did not have any corruption, and he made it profitable. And the contrast here is to the two lines that the United States government subsidize on the grounds that this is national infrastructure, private companies can't do it right, and so forth. And so they gave enormous subsidies and tax breaks, and had the military protecting all of the routes for free police service, right, and so forth. And that line was eventually built, but it was built with cost overruns of a factor of about 20, with unbelievable amounts of political corruption, bribery to public officials, money that just disappeared into private people's pockets, right, and so forth. And so one of the reasons why James Hill is a hero to me, right, is as an entrepreneur, a purely private entrepreneur, he was able to build a line that was successful, profitable, and morally clean, right, as opposed to the usual on the other side. The other famous name, of course, is Rockefeller, right? This takes enormous amounts of fuel, improved refining techniques, improved drilling techniques. He brought the price of oil down, right, so that people could afford it. People who used to have to light their homes with candles, but candles are made largely by hand, very expensive, made it possible for people to have a nightlife with oil and fueling the cars, right, and so forth. And so the pioneer there. Now, when we confront the intellectuals, right, and politicians, right, and the people who are on the other side of the debate from us, one of the strategies that I think we can use is to say that entrepreneurship is foundational to the success. Anything that we want to do in politics, anything that we want to do in science, in the arts, takes money. We have to free the entrepreneurs, let them do their thing if we want to get the wealth and all of the indirect goodies that are going to come from it. It's not going to happen any other way. Right? We need the smart, creative people to make our lives better for us, and so forth. Now, more targetedly, if we take entrepreneurs and we focus on that, one thing that is happening in the economics profession now that I think is very healthy is that macroeconomics is becoming less important, and we are shifting toward a more microeconomic entrepreneurial focus. One of the very weird things about 20th century economics is how little entrepreneurs are ever talked about. Instead, economic models are all very high-level abstraction, and the argument, or the theory here is that from a macroeconomic perspective, an economy as a whole, we draw abstract supply and demand, marginal utility, right, and so forth, charts and so forth. But the way economies run is because central people who are looking at the economy as a whole tweak the interest rate here, right, or they adjust the money supply here. And from that top-down perspective, everybody else in the economy is pushed around, right, by these macroeconomic forces. So it's very centralized intellectually and top-down in terms of its understanding of how an economy works. But in the last generation, right, you start to see economists talking more about bottom-up understandings about how economies work. It starts with entrepreneurs who are innovative, right, who come up with creative ideas that can't necessarily fit into the pre-existing models. They disrupt everything, and the economy goes off in a direction that would not be foreseeable from a central planning top-down perspective. So pushing entrepreneurship as the most fundamental phenomenon in the economic realm, I think, is healthy, and it's going to undermine